which is a pretty big artery. And until a couple days ago, it was a complete ghost town. For some reason, the last few days, it's picked back up to maybe a soft version of normal, but there were a couple weeks there where it was very eerie and quiet, and the only traffic was unfortunately the emergency vehicles. So
yeah.
You see, we are live on YouTube, by the way.
Hey, now we're live. That's what I've been working on these past few minutes. It had some sort of glitch. It was saying meeting not started, which was obviously not true, but now it is working. Okay, so I think we can get started now. I can hear both of you. You both can hear me, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Looks like we have 40 or so people on right now, and it's going up, so we can get started. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kobe Rizik, and I'm the president of the Buckley program. Before I introduce our guest this afternoon, I want to say a few quick words about the program. First, for those who are online who may not know, the William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, as well as an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows on campus have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus by providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought. The Buckley program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere, especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge. Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program as well as how to become a Buckley Fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Any students online, please consider applying for the Buckley program's seminar this August titled Shakespeare's Depiction of Rome, which will be taught by Professor Vicki Sullivan of Tufts University. The deadline for applying is this coming Saturday, so just a few days out, April 25th. All fellows who complete this August seminar will also be awarded a $150 stipend. Also, by way of reminder, if folks didn't see the email, we are excited to announce the launch of our What I Would Have Said webinar series. It's held in a similar spirit to our annual disinvitation dinner. This online series will provide a platform for speakers who have also been disinvited or disrupted in some way. They'll have the chance to share their insights, and all of you will have the chance to ask them questions. Our first such event will be with writer and AEI scholar Christina Hoff Summers next Monday, April 27th at 4:30 p.m. Right here on Zoom. She will discuss what's right and badly wrong with feminism. So we hope you can join us. Now on to our guests this afternoon, David Bergeron. Am I saying that right, Bergeron?
Bergeron.
Bergeron. I'm glad you told me that. Bergeron is a senior fellow for post-secondary education at the Center for American Progress. Mr. Bergeron previously served as the acting assistant secretary for post-secondary education in the U.S. Department of Education. In this position, Bergeron acted as the education secretary's chief advisor on higher education issues and administered more than 60 grant and loan programs that provide nearly $3 billion annually to institutions of higher education. Mr. Bergeron also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, Planning, and Innovation. In this capacity, Bergeron was responsible for the program budget for the federal post-secondary education programs and the Federal Student Aid Office, which generate more than $160 billion in financial aid to more than 25 million students enrolled in America. Prior to joining the department, Bergeron received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Sociology from the University of Rhode Island, and also worked for a bank in the consumer loan division. On to our next guest, Ms. Inez Stepman. Inez Stepman, am I saying that correctly?
Yep.
Okay, great. Is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. She has worked in education policy for 7 years, and prior to joining the Independent Women's Forum, was the Director of Education and Workforce Development at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Ms. Stepman's research focuses on educational freedom, school choice, as well as the cultural impact of empowering parents with control over their children's educations. Inez is the author of numerous policy papers, including the annually compiled report card of American education, which ranks the states across 6 aspects of education policy. Her thoughts on education have been published in many outlets such as the Washington Examiner, the Orange County Register, The Hill, and many others. Inez is a proud first-generation American. She holds a BA in philosophy from the University of California, San Diego, as well as a JD from the University of Virginia Law School. We're thrilled to welcome Mr. David Bergeron and Ms. Inez Stetman this afternoon for a debate on student loan forgiveness policy and tuition-free public universities. In the midst of current political discourse, especially around the Democratic primary, this has been an issue of much dissent and disagreement. We hope that providing our 2 wonderful guests a platform to present their opposing views on this issue this afternoon, we can set an example for a civil, good faith conversation about this very complex subject. I'm going to give a brief overview of the format of today's firing line, and then we'll move right in to the opening statements. So we will have 5 minutes for each guest, starting with Mr. Bergeron, then moving to Ms. Stetman for opening statements. I think some of them are, I guess that was you, Inez, might have a visual aid, but both are invited to
how the whole thing progresses. I have some charts, but
right.
We'll
so there's the share screen function for both of you that you can use if you have any charts. So don't hesitate to use that. And then we'll do 2 minutes for each other's responding to each other's opening statements, and then we'll move right into questions from myself and the audience, and then hopefully give 5 minutes or so for each guest to provide a closing statement. Though the closing statement, don't feel obligated to use all of that time if you don't need to. Before we move in, I just want to explain to any of our first-time Zoom attendees. So you can ask questions on the Q&A feature. You should be able to do that in your Zoom interface. So go ahead and type up a question. We'll do our best to get to as many of you as possible. And then if for whatever reason you're not able to type up a question, you can also raise your hand within the Zoom interface. And if I see your hand up, I can call on you, turn on your audio, and you can ask your question that way. So I think that's all for the logistics side of things. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming. We can't do a round of applause really, since everybody's muted. But everybody's join me in warmly welcoming David Bergeron and Inez Stetman virtually to Yale and to the William F. Buckley Jr. program. So Mr. Bergeron, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Kobe. Thanks for inviting me to do this. So I'm new to Zoom, so I wasn't planning on any charts, which probably will spare you. I generally rely on charts heavily. So this will be an interesting experience, me speaking with no chart. I came to a conclusion that we needed to forgive all student loans only very recently. For much of my career, actually before I started working for the federal government, I thought it was important to fix student loans. I didn't think that we should get rid of them, we should fix them. Beginning as I did in the Carter administration, tells you how old I am and how long I've been in this line of work. Student loans were viewed as a policy lever to help expand access to higher education. And it was a way to provide access without incurring significant new government spending, because of course loans would be repaid, and therefore loans were cheaper to provide to students and got the same result, or that, at least that's what we thought. We thought that more students would be able to afford college if we provided student loans. Then, of course, we saw a rise in abuse, particularly by the for-profit sector, and that led 2 Republican administrations to begin work trying to identify bad actors and impose sanctions on, particularly on institutions that had excessively high defaults. Ironically, as I mentioned, this is during Republican administrations are very concerned about government spending, and Bill Bennett led the charge to impose sanctions for the high default rates. And so we had a period of about 10 years of trying to ferret out bad actors as a way to address issues of access while using student loans as a mechanism. Under Bill Clinton, we began to think it was important to make student loans more student-friendly, to move towards more flexible repayment options, using direct loans rather than bank-based loans, so that we could provide income-based repayment plans, and ultimately provide for loan forgiveness after a significant number of years, 25 or 30 years of repayment. So then come forward a little bit more, and we get to the Bush administration where we viewed student loans as a way to expand grants, reduce subsidies, increase fees on student loans, and all of a sudden you had new revenues that could be plowed back into providing additional grant aid. And then the credit crisis hit. And all of a sudden we had to find a way to stimulate and provide additional capital to the student loan markets. And so we went through a period of years trying to buy up student loans as a way to again balance the federal budget, provide access, and provide liquidity in the bank-based loan system. Fast forward to the Obama administration again, and we again began to think very strongly about the need to both deal with integrity and quality in higher education while making student loans more friendly to students. All along the way, what we failed to do was to address the fundamental question, which is why loans in the first place? And the answer to this is pretty important, and that is that student loans were introduced in the 1950s as a way to manipulate students into becoming teachers and other other professions that were in high demand in exchange for student loans. And so the loan programs, the National Defense Education Loan Program, was created in order for the loans to be forgiven. And somewhere along the line, we forget that. We forget that the original reason for doing student loans was to conduct an experiment as into whether or not we could provide encouragement for people to pursue fields of study that would ultimately allow them to enter professions that we thought were important. We forgot, though, that it was an experiment. And what we forgot in doing that was that the experiment failed. We learned early on, even before I joined the Department of Education, that you couldn't use student loans to manipulate people into doing things. And so we created a system that's unsustainable and tears at the fabric of our communities by pitting generations against each other. Clearly, we as people like me, baby boomers, got the best of the deal. We got low cost higher education, mostly through public institutions with modest levels of debt. Each successive generation has seen the costs rise and debt with it, until fewer and fewer graduates gain an economic advantage from going to college. And that is the reality we need to address through loan forgiveness. It is a matter of intergenerational justice.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Ms. Setman, now your opening statement.
Sure. First of all, just thank you so much to the Buckley program. It's a real honor to be here, especially given the legacy of your name. You know, thanks to the participants for sticking it out with this format. I know we're all sort of trying to figure out how to make a lot of things work these days. So right off the bat, I think David and I don't so much disagree on the scope of the problem, right? You're not going to hear me argue that student loan debt is not a massive drag on my generation and probably will be on Gen Z in a way that it wasn't for previous generations. So I think we both agree that there is a serious problem. Where we're going to disagree is that I think that the solutions proposed, whether making college free, quote unquote, or massive student loan forgiveness, actually are not going to solve the underlying problem, which is college cost, right? That intergenerational warfare that David referred to, and sometimes I think causes a lot of disconnect between generations. When older generations think about, being able, for example, to quote unquote work your way through college, right? Now we see college costs expanding well beyond probably what a full-time income looks like for most 18-year-olds, right? Let alone a part-time income or working summers. So there is a real generational disconnect between just understanding of just how bad the college cost problem has gotten. So while I don't agree with the solutions, I'd like to talk about the actual underlying problem of cost, and then maybe propose some solutions to deal with that underlying problem, which I think is really driving the student debt crisis. We're just trying to fix the consequences of that cost problem. So I think what we need is not a forgiveness program that's paid for by the majority of Americans who do not have a four-year degree, and I think that that's an unfairness. But a solution that finally looks at this cost problem and starts to look at ways to bend that cost curve downwards in higher education and make routes to success for young Americans more flexible and less expensive, and therefore not end up with this huge balloon, 1.7, 1.6, 1.7 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. So the underlying problem here is that tuition has been skyrocketing far above inflation, right? So public university tuition has increased by about 3 times since 1990. Private universities started at a higher rate, but are following the same basic trajectory. This is the real problem. And like I said, I think this is why there's a lot of generational disconnect about this. This is just since 1990, right? So if somebody went to college, let's say in the late 80s, early 90s, they were looking at a fundamentally different cost calculation than somebody who went in the 2000s and somebody who goes in the 2010s and for the future, people going to college in the next decade. So these increases are totally out of sync with other expenses and other products and other services in our economy. Most have either gotten cheaper in real costs, in real dollars over the last 30 years, or they're the subject of constant debates, right? So for example, healthcare, we're all aware of the debate we're having over the cost of healthcare. Like, why is it that healthcare costs have gone up so much and are squeezing middle-class families? Well, college tuition has gone up by even more, relatively speaking, than healthcare costs, right? So why exactly is it that college tuition is, inflating at such an incredible high rate above and beyond even something like the healthcare system that is the subject of national debate, right? So 2 words, David mentioned Secretary Bennett, but he also advanced the so-called Bennett Hypothesis, right? That's the idea that federally backed student loans, the fact that the government is the one ultimately backstopping these student loans and now is the direct, David's right, we've moved since the Obama administration to direct lending from the Department of Education. Now 92% of loans are either reside or were originated in the Department of Education. But long before that, it was federally backed student loans, right? The Bennett hypothesis is that is what is creating a large part of this upward pressure that then results in higher and higher costs. So that's been confirmed by a number of studies since the Bennett years. For example, the New York Federal Reserve estimates that for every additional dollar in student loans the government makes available, college tuition goes up by 66 cents. So in a totally simplified, version, right? If there's a certain number of dollars available in a loan, let's say, $60,000, I'm just making up these numbers. But then it creates an incentive because colleges know that people have some savings. Most middle-class families have some savings. They know that they can bump it up above that 60,000. And then when government goes back in and says, well, how much does college cost? Oh, now it's 65,000. Okay, the loan amount is now 65,000. So in a very simplified way, you can see how that creates this upward pressure on the prices. So I'm going to kick this even further back than beginning in the Carter administration, because federal government involvement with student loans really became started in earnest under the Great Society, under LBJ. And in my view, that has created three primary unintended consequences. One of which, the most important that we're talking about now, is that massive increase in cost. The second is an explosion in the number of schools, the number of degree granting institutions in the United States, and an attendant downward pressure on academic qualifications for admission to college. And the third is what I like to call the credentialing treadmill. So if every high school graduate comes with a large student loan check from the government, without any assessment of the value, the likelihood of that of paying back that loan, or the value of the degree, as by the way, would be done in a private market, right? If you walk into Wells Fargo and you say, I want $150,000 to study, let's say one of the many studies departments that are now proliferating on universities' campuses, that might work at Yale or Harvard, because the value of the overall degree from Yale or Harvard is so high. But if you want to go to a school that's charging $40,000 or $50,000 in tuition, that, let's say, like the majority of institutions, is not even ranked on the U.S. World News Report, Wells Fargo is not going to sign on that dotted line for $150,000, because you're unlikely to be able to pay it back. But the government will sign on that dotted line and go ahead and make those loans to students. So that's created an incentive for schools to expand and to sign up as students an enormous number of people who are not even likely to graduate. So our 6-year graduation rate, not 4, but 6-year, is 60%. It represents a lot of students who have debt and no degree, which is truly the worst of all worlds. And then among graduates, 40% of graduates are in jobs that don't require or didn't previously require a college degree. And actually surveys done by large job posting websites are revealing that actually more and more employers are sticking that college degree required on the bottom of their job listing. So the exact same job listing that hasn't changed in fundamental skills from 4 years ago is now more likely to require a college degree. That's not just harming college grads, as is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We're going to come back to you after Mr. Bergeron responds. So can you hear me, David?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So now just a 2 to 3 minute response we normally do to the opponent's opening statement.
So a couple things. First, one of the ways when we talk about price in higher education is to talk about it as though what institutions say they're going to charge, their sticker price is what they really do charge. And while the sticker price of higher education has been going up, very legitimate point, the net price has been actually trending downward, particularly at public colleges and universities, particularly for people who are below the median family income. So if you are below the median family income and you're attending a public 4-year college or university, you've seen over the last decade or so, the price you're actually being asked to pay has been declining, not increasing. And that has a lot to do with cross subsidies at the institutional level and increases in grant aid and tax benefits available to students from the federal government principally. So we do see some changes that have been occurring with regard to price that really have made college more affordable for low and lower middle income students. With regard to the Bennett hypothesis, there were also studies that, while there are some studies that support it, there are some studies that raise some significant questions, particularly because for the most part, federal student loans have annual and lifetime caps. So they're not unlimited. Where they become unlimited is at the graduate level, and that is where there are substantial amounts of debt, which is not, where there isn't so much evidence of real lifetime gains in terms of income. For some fields, clearly at the graduate level, like medicine, there are clear lifetime gains. But at the undergraduate level, we do know that there are significant gains. I am a strong believer in measuring those gains and assessing whether or not the programs that are being offered at institutions of higher education ultimately lead to gainful employment and recognized occupations. And this is something that I worked on for a great period of time during the Obama administration. And we were always surprised that it was our conservative friends who were not supportive of the efforts we were making to try to ensure that federal funds were flowing principally to programs that led to gainful employment. Finally, one of the problems we have with measuring the outcomes in terms of graduation in higher education is that we assume that everybody is enrolling to pursue a bachelor's degree. And so the cohort of graduation rate measures that we often cite really don't take into account the ultimate goal of the student who's may well be pursuing an undergraduate certificate or an associate's degree, and yet we have an expectation that they will be seeking a bachelor's degree and then compute a rate that penalizes them for actually doing what it was they intended to do all along. So those are just a few of the points I would make in response to the wonderful remarks of my colleague.
Okay, and as now you have 3 minutes or so.
All right, I'll try to address a couple of things, and clearly I didn't plan well enough for the 5-minute constraint. But so first of all, in terms of the response of gainful employment, what we're essentially talking about is a matrix that micromanages, what degrees students might pursue, and it reminds me a lot of given my background is mostly in K-12, it reminds me a lot of No Child Left Behind. There are always unintended consequences when government tries to evaluate the value of relative value of degrees. And that's why I think the more direct solution would be to actually break this long chain, starting with LBJ and going through iterations over it in every single one of the administrations, trying to deal with this problem that David has, I think, correctly identified as, an experiment. I think that the more direct way to deal with this, although few people want to hear it, is to scale back government loaning programs altogether, either to freeze them. I'm a radical. I'd like to just cut them off, in a predetermined number of years. But at minimum, we need to freeze them and then allow them to sort of tick down over time as inflation goes up. And I think we need to replace that with some things that put actual skin in the game for universities. So instead of the gainful employment regulations, which I see as sort of micromanaging from the federal government level on what students and universities, agree on courses to be offered, I favor, for example, Senator Josh Hawley's proposal that would put universities on the hook for some of their students who are defaulting after a certain number of years on those loans. And that would give them some kind of skin in the game. Now, ultimately, I think the best kind of skin in the game would be placing these kinds of risk assessments in banks where, somebody who has trained their whole life to evaluate risk is looking at them rather than through the regulatory process, which is always rife with, sort of communiques between the regulated and the regulators. But some of those intermediary steps might be, freezing the amount of student loans, looking at alternatives like ISAs. Purdue University has been very innovative. They've also done an enormous work of trying to freeze their tuition rates, as well as some public universities are doing that. For example, in Texas, there was a proposal to try to offer $10,000 degrees, and they're working towards that goal. But income share agreements, which are an alternative to loans where a student agrees to pay a fixed amount of income, let's say 10 or 15% of their income over the course of years, it can be a little more predictable and tied to student success. Again, trying to get universities to actually have some kind of skin in the game in terms of the success of their graduates. But ultimately, what we see here are the consequences of completely decoupling this entire sector and placing it on an IV drip of federal money. And while that was done with the best of intentions, especially to help lower income students go to college, what we actually see at the end of the day is there's a higher percentage of upper and upper middle income individuals in college today than when we started this Great Society program in the 1960s. So we've actually kind of seen the reverse effect ultimately of what the programs were initially intended to achieve. And I think they've achieved a lot of other negative unintended consequences such that we should be looking at scaling them back.
Right. Thank you, Inez. So we're going to move on to questions. So any of our attendees, please submit questions, either raise your hand or through the written format. But I just have a few to start us off. The first one was for, just for clarification for you, Ms. Stutman, under your proposal, which we kind of devolved the student loan process back to having it not directly given by the federal government, correct? To instead having most of the administration done through banks. Is that correct?
Yes.
So in this case, how do you see this changing? How do you see this impacting the access issue that Mr. Bergeron brought up about kind of the spirit of federally backed and now federally provided student loans is provide access to students who might not otherwise have had it? What is the interplay there with sort of the de-evolution of the loan process under your proposal?
So first of all, I want to clarify that I don't want to go back merely to pre-Obama administration, where they took the loans out of it, but they were still federally backed loans that were being administered through private banks, and then went ahead and completely centralized them in government for the most part, which is why you have more than 90% of those loans now within the Department of Ed. The fundamental problem is, even though it's well-intentioned, is that when government extends this so-called pool of money of loans, it's created a lot of terrible incentives within the sector, including some of the things that David has lamented, which is, but he kind of wants to peg it on for-profit universities, and we can have that discussion perhaps if a little bit later. But he tries to peg it on the for-profit sector. But the reality is that something like 39–40% of traditional four-year universities, private universities, can't match the gainful employment regulations that were put out by the Obama administration. They just were only applied to for-profits, which is looking at a small part of the sector, when in fact, the larger problem is the incentive to admit people who are unlikely to graduate and unlikely to be able to pay back those loans, because the university's done, right? When we talk about what's best for students, the university gets its money, right? It's the student, especially the student who doesn't graduate after 2 or 3 years and drops out, who ends up paying the largest price in terms of having to pay back those loans. It's the student who's in the same job that, minus this intervention into the market, might have gone to a high school grad. It's the student who then has to take out a large amount of debt, get a degree from a university that is in one of our 4,000 colleges and universities, which is way more than any other nation, as far as I'm aware. And that is not helping the student, right? And I'm open to arguments that universities provide some sort of intrinsic benefit, that even if we can't see the benefit in dollars and cents, that the study of the classics, sort of traditional learning, of higher learning is of intrinsic value, and perhaps we should be willing to invest in that. But I don't see a lot of evidence, in fact, that today's universities are actually completing that higher goal, which is why I think that really the only people making out well in this system are actually universities. And as I said, low-income students are making up a proportionally smaller, now the percentage has ticked up, but that's because we have many, many more people in higher ed than we did before. But proportionally speaking, higher and middle income Americans are making up a larger percentage of those studying in higher ed institutions than they did when we started this whole mess in the 1960s. So I think that that's a pretty condemning stat of the experiment.
Great. Do you have a quick response to this, Mr. Bergeron?
Yeah, so in the 1970s, the college going rate for low-income individuals was about 30%. Today, the college going rate for low-income individuals is about 66%. So the rate of attendance for low-income individuals is doubled because of the federal investment. At the same time, the share of upper income individuals who are going on to college is going up, but it's not nearly, it doesn't have room to double. It never had room to double. Basically, we're getting low income students going at the rate that affluent students did in the 1970s. So the other point I would mention is if we devolved it entirely to lenders, we would I think have a situation where students attending historically Black colleges, community colleges, and regional four-year institutions, both public and private, would be squeezed out of the marketplace because lenders just aren't going to lend there. Lenders would lend in the 1950s to students going to Harvard and Yale. But in the 1950s, they didn't lend to the students going to the University of Rhode Island, never mind Rhode Island College. And so I think we would see a substantial reduction in access to higher education at a time when our economy needs more educated individuals than ever.
I'm not going to continue the back and forth, don't worry, but this is perhaps one, just to clarify, both what David's saying and what I'm saying are both simultaneously true, even though they sound contradictory about low-income students. And I just wanted to show this chart. I'll try the share screen thing here.
Go ahead.
Is that working? Okay, share. Is that working for folks? Can you see my computer?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see this is the highest quintile, and you can see it has gone up substantially, but you see how these third and fourth quintiles are pulling away, but everybody is increasing, right? Here's that doubling that David was talking about from, right, up from previous years, but previous decades rather. But what you can see is these two quartiles are pulling away in terms of the trajectory. We are seeing a larger percentage of higher income individuals in college, even though we're also seeing an increase in lower income individuals going to college. So just wanted to clarify, this is not like wasn't even necessarily a rebuttal, just a little clarification there.
Okay, and I'm going to, yes, thank you. I'm going to move on to some of our questions that have been submitted on the Q&A Zoom here. One is for Mr. Bergeron. So first, do you agree with Inez that college budgets in general are far too bloated and perhaps bloated in the wrong areas, such as administration? And if so, I guess if not, how do you think that this plays with the issue of cutting student loans? The common argument is that if total student loans were reduced, then universities would be forced to reduce some of the bloat that we see in administrative areas and perhaps make the whole system more efficient. There's a lot of assumptions there, and I'm curious about whether or not you agree.
So I'll try a couple of examples. So University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, their per student revenues are in excess of $100,000 per student. Sounds bloated to me. Michigan, University of Michigan, Michigan State is about $80,000. Sounds a little bloated. How about Henry Ford at about $10,000 per student? Sound bloated? The reason I use those examples is there are a lot more Henry Ford colleges than there are flagship public institutions. And so when we say that the spending is bloated, it all depends. And the vast majority of our students go to public institutions. Vast majority of our students in public institutions go to community colleges and regional four-year publics. And so it is, in my opinion, there are some institutions where there is potential for bloat, but they're not the vast majority of them.
Ms. Stetman, do you have a response to this?
While it's true that there's enormous variation between schools, I think it's kind of hard to deny that there is enormous bloat overall. So, for example, there's been 21 million square feet of new university construction just in the last 20 years. And that's been part of that arms race, facilities arms race that universities have done to compete for students who then have those federal loan dollars, right? So they're actually competing for students, even though a lot of them may be academically unprepared or unlikely to graduate, they're competing for them by building an enormous amount of world-class facilities. And then in terms of administration, we've seen that go up by 60% over the last decade, and that's 10 times more than tenured faculty positions have opened up, right? So you see the disproportionate spending in administration and bureaucratic bloat, rather than on tenured faculty and actually on teaching and learning. And so I think it's hard to argue that overall the university sector is not bloated and not spending a lot of money that they don't need to. Now, I don't know if we'll get to at all how this current crisis might affect the university sector, but perhaps this is an opportunity for some universities to get their budgets under control, because I think all of us, including universities, are going to go into a period of belt tightening. But for now, and certainly for the last 2 decades, I think there's a lot of evidence that overall there is quite a bit of fat in the university system to cut.
Great, thank you. Another question we have just submitted here is we've seen, and I'm reading the question now, we've seen rural colleges and universities face increasing financial difficulties. Cutting back liberal arts programs is one of those examples. Should the federal government increase support for rural colleges, which often provide stable employment and have historical legacies, and if so, how? And up to you two, which one starts on that question?
So I'll start. I'm very concerned about what's going on with regard to rural colleges in the United States. They are the heart and soul of so many communities around the country. That said, it's very hard to see how the federal government can increase support to those institutions when they're not attracting students. And the way in which the federal government has provided money to institutions, at least since the 70s, has been in the form of grants or loans that follow students. And so if the students aren't going to colleges in the rural areas, then we've got to really think seriously about what we do to support those institutions, because they are vital to their communities. But it's going to take a lot of creative thinking to figure out how to do that.
So 2 points to address it, 2 separate aspects, one about liberal arts and one about rural schools. I agree with David that it's difficult to support universities that aren't attracting students. And I think one of the few positive aspects of the system that we've created is that at least aid is tied to student enrollment. Now, if we move to a quote unquote free college system, that aspect will disappear, right? So that's one of the only constraints on the upward push on tuition, right? Is the fact that the entire millennial generation, my generation, right, has been screaming bloody murder about the fact that we haven't been able to pay off our student loans, and we're pushing off, purchasing houses and starting families because of the enormous burden of student loan debt. That itself may create some kind of, sorry, there's a siren coming, but that itself might create a certain amount of pushback against that upward trend. Should I just mute it can you guys hear the siren? Or
we can hear.
Okay.
Well, we can hear it, but we can also hear you.
Okay. So I think that aspect of the system is valuable, and I would be really reluctant about knocking out that student pressure, because at least now, even though other kinds of pressures that would exist in a normal free market don't exist, at least students after the fact can say, this was a really bad deal, perhaps you shouldn't take it. And that itself, does make universities think twice about how they can keep their tuition, from continuing to explode upward. And that's what we see in the data, by the way, in nations that do move to free colleges, right? A free college system. In Germany, when they moved to a free college system, they saw a 37% increase in tuition very, very quickly. So what we've gone to do in most European countries is sharply cap the number of students, right? So there's this inherent tension there between how easy financially it is to go to college. And in America, we push off that financial easiness onto student loan debt that then becomes a problem for students. But how easy it is to enroll and sign on that dotted line. And then, we see that explosion of seats because every student comes with a check, and we see a lot of unscrupulous schools or just schools that, don't offer the value that is worth it. Oh man. And so there's that inherent tension there between those things, and European countries deal with that by capping. Like David is worried about, the fact that low-income students won't be able to attend university if we freeze student loans. Well, in places where we move to free college, they just cap the number of students, and there's some evidence that, for example, in the UK, it doubled the gap between low-income and higher-income students, because the students who didn't make the cutoff tended to be low-income.
Great. So I'm going to move on to a question. And just as a quick aside before I move on, you talked about getting kind of creative for the rural universities, Mr. Bergeron. And I know that many of the public, rural, and regional universities, including I'm home here, my home is Alaska, which is where I'm broadcasting from right now, were created or received their land under the Morrill Land Grant Public University Act from the late 1860s. And many public universities that are land grant colleges have not received nearly what they are entitled to receive under the Land Grant Acts from the federal government. So I guess that's one creative way to help those universities out.
Well, the issue with the land grants is they tend to be actually in the more urban areas of the states, even where there's large rural populations, or rural areas. My wife is from Montana. Montana State is in Bozeman, which is for Montana standards, a fairly urban part of the state. It's not in, one of the more rural areas, right, where so many colleges are closing, and where so many colleges are, when they close, are really closing the town.
So one of the questions that was just put in and this kind of goes along the same vein as Ms. Stepman's recent response. So the question is free college tuition to community colleges and public higher education institutions a solution to the student loan challenge, which is sort of what you two were discussing, but maybe go a little more in depth on that.
So I think, let me start for a minute. So I think that free college is a necessary thing for us to pursue in terms of how to enable more students to go onto higher education in areas where we need them to. The focus has clearly been nationally on community colleges, and I think there's a good value in that approach, as they're gateway institutions. They provide that opportunity, and they're institutions that, by and large, more affluent students don't choose to go, even if they're available to them. More affluent students will, even if there's no student loans available, I think will still be attracted to the opportunities provided by flagship public and by private Ivy League and sub-Ivy institutions. And so they'll continue to go there, and community colleges will continue to provide their access mission, as well as some of the strong regional 4 years.
So to directly address the question, and I saw one other participant had asked a question about forgiveness ultimately, right? So we have these two solutions: forgiveness on the back end and free college on the front end. And they're usually presented together because, if you just forgive the debt of one generation, put that debt onto the future generation that continues to deal with the skyrocketing college costs, in 20 years, you're just going to have another generation that needs debt forgiveness. And I think That's why those solutions are often presented together rather than one or the other. But ultimately, I think both of them fail to address the underlying problem that both David and I have been wrestling with and have different answers for, or different, sort of shades of what the problem really looks like. But to me, the fundamental problem here is that it costs so darn much to get a college degree. And if we don't fix that underlying problem, we can actually make it worse by knocking out debt on the back end in that kind of way. All that does is further encourage the upward price of college on people who are entering the system, because then people say, okay, well, but my loans will just be forgiven at the end. So there's even less fiscal restraint and all of the normal kinds of value evaluations that would happen in a free market. And then free college just cuts out the student altogether, cuts out any kind of feedback from students in a way in terms of college costs, and it just writes the check directly to the institutions. And that's why we do see in nations that do have free college, they see that cost climbing up and up and up and up. And at the end of the day, they just have to cap students, right? They just have to say there's a hard number of students who are accepted to university. And then that ends up cutting out low-income students or students who are on the bubble. And so that's usually the opposite of what people who are proponents of these policies, want to see, right? They want to see more access for low-income individuals to college, not less. And so ultimately, I think both of those solutions, they don't solve the underlying problem, and they have the potential to make the underlying problem worse.
Great, thank you. And I want to ask this question here that was just submitted. Have those who study, so have you two looked at how student loans and fees are handled in other countries like the UK? This person says in the UK, the number of students is not capped except for a few programs such as medicine, dentistry, and veterinary school.
So I can't pretend to be an expert in every single one of these university systems. I think in France they have pretty strict caps, but perhaps David can correct me on that one. But I can say that the research that I looked at before and after they provided sort of a universal system, it showed that there was actually the gap between lower income and higher income students actually doubled, and that's from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Yeah, there are examples of countries where there are caps. Generally, there's a relationship of both the supply of students coming into higher education. That is you've got population pressures that drive caps much more than the imposition of free college. In a state like Rhode Island, we were a state that imports students from out of state because our population is in decline. Other states in the West, like Arizona, are importing, not importing students. They have more demand than they have supply, and it's certainly true in other countries. Japan is in negative growth. South Korea is in negative growth in terms of population, particularly college age going population, and that certainly determines whether or not there are needs for caps, and I think that's probably why there aren't caps in the UK.
So just one clarification: caps don't always have to look like a quota cap, just a flat number. One of the other ways that university systems in European countries cap is just by score enrollments, right? So they have tests just like we do, various and different ones in different countries, but they have a cutoff score for admittance, and generally there's fewer, more selective colleges, whereas in the US we have only about 50 or so colleges that admit a third or fewer of their applicants. That's about, and then we have 4,000 universities out there, only 14 of which are actually ranked on the US World News Report. So we have many more universities, and many of them are much less selective than in most of the nations that have what might be termed in some form of free college system.
Yeah. I'll just say that when you add for-profits to your number, you get to 7,600.
Okay, even more.
Even more.
So, and this question is it's directed towards Ms. Stetman, but obviously both should answer. So for Ms. Stetman, would you propose that universities simply admit many fewer students, especially those less academically prepared? And if so, how would this affect the employment prospects of those students?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a politician, so I have the freedom to say that. Yeah, I do think we're admitting too many people to university, and ultimately, it's not helpful for two reasons. One, you do have a lot of people dropping out during the duration, and then ending up, as I said, in the worst of all worlds, which is you have debt but you don't have a degree. And by the way, it says something about the value of universities that otherwise you'd see more of a flat curve in terms of the number of years completed. Now you do see a bump for some university, but you don't see that flat curve. What you see are massive spikes for the degrees, right? And that leads me to my second objection, which is overall we're creating this credentialing treadmill that is it's actually harming Americans, especially Americans who only have a high school diploma. Life has been getting worse for them because we've made so many seats available through federal loans in colleges. Because what we're seeing is while the income levels for those with a bachelor's degree are stagnating somewhere around 75,000, which you used to see an upward trend, right? People were making more and more money. Now we're seeing that stagnate. But we're seeing an even worse trend for those with high school diplomas, because a lot of those jobs that were previously available for those with high school diplomas are now have that little sign at the bottom that says bachelor's required. And so what you're seeing is a lot of college grads who do make it through, but perhaps in some of those less selective colleges of the 7,000 something, and they're filling jobs that, one, make it extremely difficult for them to pay those student loans, and two, because they're filling those jobs, it's much more difficult for Americans who don't go to college at all to get their foot into the labor force and to succeed without that college diploma. So this free money from the federal level system has had sort of cascading effects downward. And so, yeah, when I say that we should have fewer colleges in this country and probably fewer people should go to college, I realize that sounds harsh, but the reality is that this system is actually making life worse. And we're finding that a lot of these college grads are working in jobs where 4, 5, 10 years ago, they wouldn't have needed a college degree to work that job, except now they have, some level of debt. The average debt burden is still, over $30,000. That's a really, really harsh debt burden for somebody who's working a job that was previously available to people with a high school diploma. So I ultimately, overall, I don't think that it's helping people.
David, did you want to respond?
So my belief is that this idea that we're providing education that is not valued in the marketplace isn't borne out by the income gains that graduates receive. A large segment of it, though, is really tied to what the field of study is that the graduate gets the credential in. And very clearly there are distinctions that the labor force has been making about what is valuable for our economy. And I think in the era that we are in the way in which the world is changing and will continue to change, we will see some significant differences going forward in terms of what is valued and remunerated in our economy.
Thank you. So now we're just going to do, and obviously this is strict, 2 minutes or so each for closing statements. And since we did opening starting with Mr. Bergeron, we'll do closing starting with Ms. Stetman. And then after that will conclude our event. Boy, it really feels like it went by fast.
So I think the one thing that I would add to our discussion that hasn't been touched on is what universities are really offering. And it seems to me that they've made two basic promises that then justify this enormous federal investment, right? And the first was, of course, the one that we've really been focusing on, right? Which is, you know, gets people into higher paying jobs that then goes ahead and boosts the economy. That's the basis of all the, you know, the stats that you hear about. If we invest $1 in higher ed and student loans, then it'll produce, you know, X number of dollars for the economy. That promise is still somewhat being fulfilled, but it's being fulfilled at a much lower rate of return than it has been in the past. And I think it's creating all the unintended consequences that we've been discussing for the last hour. But the second promise is, of course, that it creates better educated or more highly educated citizens, and that's intrinsically a good thing, especially in a republic, especially since we have a voting population. And unfortunately, we're seeing declines there as well. So reading proficiency rates among college graduates, and that is basically reading a typical newspaper article and being able to repeat back the main idea of it. So a pretty low level. We've seen only 40% of college grads, even a couple decades ago, were able to do that. Now it's 31%. So we've seen declines over the last decade in proficiency rates of college graduates. And that's just more evidence that we're not really producing a value add here. What we're doing is creating, again, this credentialing treadmill that makes everybody, you know, have to take out more debt, get more degrees, jump through more hoops, but we're not actually continuing to create that additional human capital that was imagined when we said we were going to help people go to college. And so even though that's a laudable goal, we haven't even, you know, touched on the fact that universities, something that I think you touched on in the beginning in your introduction to the Buckley program, you know, universities haven't been able to uphold their most fundamental obligations, public universities under the Constitution, which is public universities have to respect the First Amendment. They've shown some difficulty in doing that in recent years, and that's why you see public trust, especially among independents and Republicans, in universities, or for the proposition that universities are overall a net positive for the country. You're actually seeing fewer than 50% of Americans agree with that statement. And that's a sea change that's happened over the last 4 years. And so I think when you take that as a whole, you look at the entire sector, how much it's built on taxpayer dollars, and how little it's delivered in return for those taxpayer dollars. I think there's a strong argument for reducing the federal role in helping the university sector rather than increasing it through loan forgiveness or for free college. Through free college.
Thank you. David, you can go ahead whenever you're ready with your closing.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank Yale and the Buckley program for putting this on. I think it's important for us to have these kinds of conversations. It's increasingly important for us to have them across different political views. You know, it becomes very easy for us to stay within our bubble and not hear each other talk about these really critical issues. You know, I think that our higher education system is an economic engine. You know, we talked a little bit about the fact that rural institutions and rural communities are, you know, the lifeblood of those communities. And I think they're very much the lifeblood of our nation. I think that they continue to deliver substantially on the promise of growing our nation's economy. Research continues to show that for you know, investments in higher education beyond high school, we see significant returns on that investment. The problem has been that the rewards of those investments on average pay off for people. But when the economic rewards pay off on average for people, the people where the rewards are below average are significantly harmed when the way that those benefits were paid for were through debt. And so a lot of the pushback that I think we see has to do with the fact that the economic returns for the people with substantial levels of debt just aren't there, and it's often because of changes to the underlying economy and to the demand for people in particular professions. And since we have a system that allows for significant choice, that creates inequities and inequities in ways that are really difficult in a loan-based system. So I think it's important for us to move away from loans, forgive student loan debts that are outstanding, find ways to support and finance free college programs that still allow for substantial student choice, because it is, I think, really important that students still be the drivers of what education they're pursuing, because trying to have a planned economy where the government decides is not helpful. It's just not helpful for an economy that is dramatically changing in real time, as we're all seeing today.
Well, thank you to all of our attendees for joining us this afternoon. I know I speak for everyone who came online that this was a really, really interesting debate, but it felt much more like a cordial conversation, which I think is great. I certainly learned a lot. I think others did. And Inez and David, on behalf of the Buckley program, thank you so much for being with us. And we hope to see you again soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. And David, thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It was fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.